are how to set up the views in Rhino. One thing, and I know you guys have received some comments in terms of, over the course of the semester, like being too high in the perspective. Oftentimes, everyone's kind of floating up kind of like a ghost, right? And really, you want to be able to, and it's not that bird's eye perspectives aren't valuable, but when you have a model, then the actual image rendering wants to do something else. And there are a variety of ways to make sure that you're on the right ground plane or your eye is at the right level. What I did here was just set up some simple poles. And I know that those poles are 6 feet tall. And so when I'm looking at a particular view, and this is just a straight perspective view, and I align those horizontally, more or less I know that that's eye level, right? Another thing that I've done, and maybe I'll show this at a different point, was just draw a big rectangle kind of around the main object and raise that up to a 6 foot level. This is a little bit different because there was some topography there. Raise it up to a 6 foot level. So I know if that line in perspective is just looking like a line, or that rectangle rather is not distorted or vanishing back, rather it looks more so like a line, I know I'm very close to eye level. And so that's one way just to kind of check. That's the way that I do it. I'm sure that there are other ways. It's a good way for me to visually understand where I am in that space and that it's an appropriate perspective. The one thing that I think is pretty critical, depending on the kind of perspective view you're trying to set up, is to work with the lens length of the camera, basically the camera width here. This is accessible in a couple different ways. I'll just, I wanted to make sure, I think it's in viewport. So if I go to viewport, there's this, it's kind of an unassuming icon, but this is the lens length tool. So here I can change the lens length so I can get a little bit further into that space, so it's going to widen it up a little bit and have a little bit more of a dramatic view. Depending on where you are, you may want to be really drastic if you're really trying to get to the interior of a space. So that's something to kind of play around with in terms of setting up the right view. I oftentimes would have this out as another tab just so I can get to it quickly. And the way to do that, I just right click on this upper toolbar area, show toolbar, and then you can scroll down to lens length, and just toggle that on. You'll have this floating window here. But since I don't have much screen real estate, I'll turn that off. So that's the way to kind of set it up, right? Set up the view and also set up the camera angle. I'm going to actually bring it down to that, 25. And try to line those up a little bit. This is actually like 4 to 6 inches up, so just make that. And then, so I'm kind of rotating around. Another nice trick, if you're trying to really get hit the sweet spot in terms of the angle of that view, and you only want to navigate or orbit horizontally, you're able to right click here and hold your shift key down, and that's going to just let you rotate horizontally. It won't go vertically at all. So I'll maintain that same height, and I could just rotate around this whole thing without worrying about adjusting back that eye level again. So that's almost, you can see I'm pretty close there with those two poles. So now I can rotate around. So that ends up being fairly handy. Then the next thing that's really important, once you feel like it's a good view, I don't feel that with this yet. Or that's a little bit better. Let's go with that. Is to go ahead and save that view. And this is I went ahead and I removed a lot of the named views that I had, but I had several all the way around. And again, the naming convention gets to be really important. That's why you're seeing the one file type that was stage left or stage right. That's giving me some clue about this as a pavilion, where the general view is. But if I go into the viewport pull down here in the upper left hand corner and go over to where is it? Set view. Here's where you can also get to top, bottom, right, front, and so forth. The perspective, isometric is here as well. But I can also go into named views. So if I select that, these are all the named views I've had. And so I have this previous, which is the same view that was in the images I was showing. Not this one, but that one. But I can go ahead and now save this view as something else. So I can hit the save, and it's going to ask me what I want to save it as. I'm actually going to cancel this, and I want the naming convention to be similar to this one. And so it's going to assume that I want that name, but I'm going to go ahead and change it. Stage left. Front one, I'll just leave it as front one, and now kind of generally I know what that view is, and it's going to give me a little vignette of what that actual view is. So then no matter where you are, navigating around or modeling or doing whatever it is you're doing, if I want to get back to that exact view, I can just double click that view, double click the other view, and I'm there. You can also, it'll also show up then on the pull down if you don't want that window open. I have stage right, stage left. Another thing that you want to make sure you have a grip on are the render settings. And so Rhino Render is going to be able to give you some tonality. It's going to be able to give you some shadows and so forth. But you have to be able to control, of course, the sun and the overall settings for the output, and that would also include materials with that. So I'm just going to right click here on this sphere, the blue sphere for render. And I'll get to the render settings. It basically brings up the document properties for Rhino. And in this case, I can set the overall dimensions of the render. So I can either default to the viewport, so whatever my viewport is showing me, or I can have something else that's custom. And this starts to come into play once you start outputting in different ways from Rhino. You want to make sure that you are at least at that overall resolution, or you're exceeding that resolution. If you have any imagery that then starts to become below that, then you're going to start dealing with some resolution issues. It will start to appear to be somewhat degraded. So I could toggle that here. I can also change the DPI here as well. Sometimes if I know I'm going to print this, I would probably at least double that, right? So about 144. 72 dots per inch is generally for on-screen imagery. So I can make this a little bit different, or I can lock to whatever the viewport is showing me, or make those changes there. The other thing in terms of these settings that are important, you can play around with the ambient light. Usually the defaults are okay, but that's something that can start to get a little wacky in terms of trying to find where you began. So there's that. Usually I don't play around with that, or I haven't recently. The background I have is a solid color only because I'm going to toggle the transparent background. So that's going to allow me to, even in the case of like this Brise Soleil here, there won't be any, that'll be transparent. So I'll be able to slip something else behind that in the rendering and allow that to become part of the overall image, as opposed to having to delete white spaces and have kind of messy edges and so forth. So that starts to be important. I would recommend that everyone experiment with a rendering with the skylight and without the skylight. With the skylight, it's sort of like a backlight, and so your shadows won't be as deep. And without it, you're going to have some very deep shadows. Sometimes you want some really nice deep shadows, right? And so it's not that it's not too much to have one render with and one render without, of course, then you can just include that somehow in your naming convention. Use lights on layers that are off. Lighting could be a little bit tricky just with a regular Rhino render. I don't think we'll get into like any night renderings, although I can show you a few things after today about how to do that. But generally, I don't have that checked because typically with the same kind of setup, I'll want to be able to render daylight images as well as night images. So I don't usually toggle that. Nor do I toggle to render the curves or the ISO curves because there'd just be added line work there. The other thing, let's see, render tools. And you've all been working with the sun, but again, to set up the sun for the image that you think is going to be most appropriate or depict your project the best. And so toggling this like we have in the past with the other sun studies, and then just making sure to note the time, right? What time is it? I generally use the same season, so I don't mess around with the month or anything, so that's just typically consistent for each of the renders, although you could document that as well. Hey, this happens to be my birthday. Anyway, so you can document that and make sure that you know what time of day it is for each of those renders. Again, so you can mimic that exact same setup if you decide to change something in the model, right? That's one of the most critical things. So you should start to have an accumulating set of named views here, so you can always go back to those in case you tweak one thing here or there to modify the image. So that's good practice there. The other thing that I just wanted to cover here before I sort of open it up for questions is setting up some basic materials. Now in the layers panel here, of course you can turn on and off layers, you can create layers, lock layers, give layers a particular color, which comes in really handy. Of course you can see that this model has a lot of different layers, even has multiple like layers for steel. There's that one, which is the magenta, that blue one, and then a light blue one. Each of those are a little bit different. And then I know that visually just because there's different layers. But if you keep going, I'll just bring this all the way out. You can see that there are other settings as well. And the circles here, and usually with the default, it's just going to be white, so it might be a little bit hard to see. But those are materials that then are assigned by layer. And so I think it's really important then to keep layer management there, so no matter what, you're not dealing with miscellaneous objects that may have a material by object, meaning it just has its own attributes regardless of the layer it's on. That can really get messy really quickly, right? So if you do it by layer, then you just know anything that's on that layer is going to have that materiality, and you can adjust accordingly. But if and we can just look at the steel here as an example, click on that circle, I'm going to get this layer material dialog box. And I actually think that some of the more important settings here are the basic settings, and I think that's basically it. Here you should be able to create any kind of transparency, so you can see down below I can give this transparency. You can see a little kind of mock-up up above. I can give it reflectivity if I wanted to reflect things that are around it, if it's very sort of specular like a piece of glass or something. And I can also give it a gloss finish. In this case, this was meant to be Core 10 steel. Core 10 steel, as it just comes out, it's fairly raw, but at times it has a little bit of it's a little bit shiny as it starts to rust and corrode and build up that sort of protective rust coating on it. So I gave it a deep red color. I gave it just a little bit of gloss, so you might get the idea that that is steel as opposed to like a piece of wood or something like that. And I let it be that basic. I didn't need to sort of get in and start to articulate an actual, little sort of pits and so forth for the steel. And I highly recommend that in general for dealing with a materiality, especially using Rhino render. I would almost say that for a lot of the rendering engines that are out there, even Studio Max or Revit for sure, because those tend to be a little bit cartoony when their output, if there's not a lot of care put into them. But dealing with the layers of materiality and rendering can be never-ending sort of pit. You can get lost into tweaking and just trying to get the right map, and the map's not quite working, and you have to deal with the orientation, and so it can be a very consuming process. And here, this isn't necessarily a rendering class, right? Or in design, it's not necessarily about trying to depict that kind of material in a photorealistic way. It's about giving an impression of the idea, ultimately about space, and also about the language of materiality that helps to define that space. And so I tend to err, and always recommend this to students, to err towards more of a, especially when outputting from a tool like this, a more grayscale kind of palette. So you can control some of those things perhaps later, or just keep things as subtle as they need to be. In this case, because it was a weathering steel, I gave it just a little. If I click on this bar, I'm going to get this select color dialog box. And I got something close, I think, here, and then started making adjustments in terms of the black, moving this around from red. You can even start with a red, and then I could move it back to where approximately it was to get that right general color. Go ahead and cancel it, and that's about it. You can start to add material textures and maps. I really don't want you guys to spin your wheels getting into that. Again, it's fairly consuming, and I'm sure VTD has an entire class just on that, right? And so if you're really interested in that, I think that would be the place to go. Although I don't recommend, again, spending that much time, because it can be very time consuming on that for something like an architectural design project. The emission color, I don't generally play around with these. I would recommend to keep the defaults. So that's basically it in terms of materiality. These different kinds of steels that I was looking at, this is kind of a darker gray steel. That would have been a steel tubing for paint. That was this blue one. This one was a little bit, oops, wrong one, lighter gray. So just to give those different layers a little bit of depth.
So do those colors show up in the material colors? Do those show up when you print it, or?
You have to render it, and so so basically where we're setting up is like a Rhino render. So if you try to print it just from here, unless it's a rendered preview, you're not going to see those colors. So you'd actually have to go through, and that was part of the setup that we did here before with the rendering settings, where you make sure the size is right, you make sure your view is right, you have those named views, and this is basically setting up the next step where you can just put forth a render. I'm not going to do a full render here, it might take a little while, but I'll start a preview render preview. And this is because I was using Flamingo with this model, so you shouldn't have those. It's really tiny. So it'll go through and give you a quick kind of depiction about what those tones start to look like. And so then you can do that before you execute a full render, which depending on the size and the resolution can take a while. If it's taking it shouldn't take more than 20 minutes or a half hour really with these kind of renders, because especially if you're not using any texture maps or anything that's aggressive, it does get caught up with transparency, reflections, those kinds of things will bog it down a little bit. But unless it's been an intense sort of overall model, a half hour tops. It shouldn't be that long. But here, as you're working with it, you may just want to what does this look like? I'm making these changes, and so you may want to do this like I'm doing right now. You get an idea of how the steel's working, how maybe that glass isn't quite working. I have to change that. You can go back quickly then into the layer settings, tweak it, give it more or less transparency, more or less sort of gloss or reflectivity, and then do this again until you feel it's a good balance. The other thing when this continues is when you save it, again, to make sure, I think just as a good habit to save these images as PNG files. So then you do have that true transparent background so you can do some other things with it in Photoshop. If it's not, if it's a JPEG or something else, you're going to have that background, like a white background or whatever background color is set up here. And then you're going to be forced with confronting that, or that's just another step that you'd be giving yourself to edit in Photoshop or what have you. You can go ahead and include here like an alpha channel. You can get into some other settings here, and something like an alpha channel would then be another file that just gives you like the outline of what this overall rendering is. So then you can bring that into a tool like Photoshop and create a clipping mask or a mask, so you can again start to do some different things. The mask, creating a mask in Photoshop is what I want you guys to use it more so for is your line work. One thing that can be a challenge when you're scanning a graphite drawing, especially on trace paper, is the trace itself has all kinds of variations in tone, right? And sometimes that can get confused with your pencil stroke. But using the mask will allow you just to select the colors you want to actually come through, and it'll eliminate all of that rest of the haze or whatever the trace paper is about. So then you'll just have your line work. And so that's generally what we'll be using that for. But you know, it could be used for, the idea can be used for other things as well. I think that's it for now for today. I think I'd like you guys to go ahead and start trying to set up an appropriate view for what you have already in Rhino. You guys should have at least an infinite strip model in Rhino. You can elaborate on that or what have you, but start setting up that view in keeping with what we've been talking about here, and get used to how you're naming the view, documenting the sun position, of course saving the view and so forth, and thinking about different ways to set up the render. Again, and this is really small right now because I'm using this projector. Like my screen has black bars to either side, but a lot of times the viewport resolution might be enough. So if I go to, well, right now it's going to be really small because of where it is, but overall, it's a letterbox format, and generally you guys, I think, have that with your laptops. That might be enough. If you think you're going to want more resolution or a little bit more to work with, obviously you can work with that as a proportion. But once you do that, you want to make sure to monitor and know what those dimensions are. So then again, when you output in a different way, say for example, you just wanted the line work. I'm going to go to this view. And say I just wanted the line work from this, and there are a variety of ways to do that. And I'm going to switch this to, let's see, artistic. So a couple different things. You guys have already experimented with using just the print method, right, where you can print an image at a particular size. So you can document what that is, make sure it's in the right view and so forth. You can set up the file type here. The resolution, of course, you can set up. So you guys have experimented with that already. The one thing that I've noticed, and I haven't seen a setting for, is when I output a PNG, in this case, it doesn't necessarily remove the background and everything. You guys are going to be hand drawing this, so this isn't as big of an issue. But for your reference, there's another way, if I close this, there's another way to get that image from here, although it's not quite as detailed as the printing path. But if I go into display, so you can see all the different display settings that are here, but there's also this little camera that says capture viewport to file. So if I clip that, it's going to capture whatever's in that viewport, and I can basically save that as a file. Now the resolution isn't great because it's whatever your screen is. The proportions may be a little bit different than what your rendering is, so you want to monitor that. But I can get a PNG and also a transparent background, which I can toggle. So then it's just the line work that I'm dealing with. So that might be helpful for one thing or the other, although you guys will be hand drawing your perspective drawing, elaborating on it that way. Okay, so take the remainder of this session and go ahead and start trying to set up those views. Think about what angles are going to be the most compelling for your project. Start using some of the tools in terms of setting up the viewport, setting up the sun, documenting how that's going to be managed in addition to your layers. And then we'll move into some other things on Thursday.